Welcome back, beloved soul. Today we arrive at the final chapter in our Healing the Family journey. A story of walls rising, hearts returning, and households being restored one stone at a time. If you've ever felt scattered, or wondered whether something broken can truly be rebuilt, this story is for you. Settle in, take a breath, and let's walk together into the radiant household, where ancient truths meet our modern longing to come home.
The morning sun crept over the eastern hills like a hesitant child, unsure of what it would illuminate upon the broken city below. Jerusalem lay sprawled beneath that tentative lighter, once magnificent tapestry now unraveled, its threads scattered across decades of exile and neglect. A low wind threaded through the collapsed stones, carrying with it the faint chatter of life slowly returning to the city. A single bird called out above her, its cry echoing across the hollow courtyard as though awakening the memory of the place. From somewhere beyond the ruined homes, a donkey brayed, followed by the soft shuffle of merchants preparing their morning wares. Even in desolation, life was whispering itself awake. Miriam stood at the threshold of what had once been her grandmother's home. Though home seemed too generous a word for the collection of collapsed walls and sun-bleached stones that remained, she was 32 years old, born in Babylon to parents who had been born in Babylon, raised on stories of a homeland she had never seen until 3 months ago, when the caravan had finally deposited her along with hundreds of other returning exiles into this valley of rubble and weeds. The stories had been beautiful. Her grandmother, Keturah, before the fever took her in that distant city, had painted Jerusalem in words dripping with honey and light. The temple courts where children played, she would say, her clouded eyes seeing something far beyond the mud-brick walls of their Babylonian dwelling. The sound of the shofar echoing through the valleys, the smell of bread and incense and belonging. But there was no temple anymore, only the skeleton of one, and even that was being rebuilt, stone by painful stone, by hands that had never learned masonry, by hearts that had never learned what it meant to have a place where they truly belonged. Miriam kicked at a loose stone, watching it skitter across what might have been a courtyard. She felt the familiar hollowness that had lived in her chest since childhood, that persistent ache of being perpetually between. In Babylon, she had been the Jewish girl, the foreigner, the one whose people worshipped an invisible god and refused to bow to golden statues. Here, in the land that was supposed to be her inheritance, she felt equally alien. The few families who had remained during the exile looked at the returning exiles with suspicion, as if they had somehow betrayed Jerusalem by being dragged away in chains 70 years before Miriam's birth. Neither here nor there, she thought bitterly. Neither stranger nor Sidon's, just floating. You're doing that thing again. Miriam turned to find her brother Ezra picking his way through the debris. At 28, he was lanky and perpetually sunburned, his hands calloused from the construction work he'd thrown himself into since their arrival. Unlike Miriam, Ezra had embraced this broken city with the fervor of a man trying to outrun his own ghosts. Standing in ruins and looking like you've swallowed a lemon, I'm contemplating our ancestral home. You're brooding. Ezra stepped carefully over a fallen beam, his eyes scanning the destruction with that assessment gaze he'd developed. There's a difference. Miriam crossed her arms. This was supposed to be different. Coming here, I thought. She stopped, embarrassed by the childish hope that still lived beneath her disappointment and cynicism. You thought it would feel like home, Ezra finished gently. Grandmother made it sound like stepping through a doorway into where we were always meant to be. Like the moment we arrived, something would click into place. Miriam gestured at the rubble around them. Instead, I feel more lost than ever. At least in Babylon, I understood my displacement. It made sense. But here I'm supposed to belong, and I don't. And somehow, that's worse. Ezra was quiet for a moment, picking up a fragment of what might have been a ceramic jar. Do you know what Nehemiah said yesterday, during the wall assembly? Miriam shook her head. She'd been avoiding the community gatherings, finding the forced proximity of so many hopeful faces exhausting. Around them, the steady rhythm of hammers beat against stone, sending small clouds of dust drifting through the warm afternoon light. He quoted something from the old prophet Isaiah. Ezra closed his eyes, recalling the words. Around them, the steady rhythm of hammers beat against stone, sending small clouds of dust drifting through the warm afternoon light. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. Isaiah 58, verse 12. Pretty words, Miriam said flatly. Maybe. Ezra set down the ceramic fragment and looked at her. This time, really looked at her, with an expression that reminded her painfully of their mother before she'd grown distant and hollow in those final years. But Miriam, he wasn't talking about the stones. Not really. He was talking about us. The community work assignment came the next morning, delivered by a hurried-looking official who seemed to have 3 conversations happening simultaneously in his head. Miriam and Ezra were assigned to the eastern section of the wall, where a weathered stonemason named Tobiah was leading the restoration efforts. Tobiah was not what Miriam had expected. For one thing, he was old, perhaps 70, with a beard more white than grey, and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same limestone he worked. For another, he smiled constantly, which Miriam found deeply suspicious in a man surrounded by so much evidence of destruction. The sun hung low over the eastern section of the wall, casting long shadows across half-built foundations. The rhythmic clink of chisels struck a steady, almost musical cadence, broken occasionally by men calling instructions across the worksite. "Ah, the siblings!" Tobiah called out as they approached his worksite, wiping dusty hands on an equally dusty tunic. Ezra, who works like 3 men, and Miriam, who I'm told has been hiding in the lower city for 3 months. Miriam felt heat rise to her cheeks. I haven't been hiding. Of course not. Observing, assessing, perfectly reasonable. Tobiah's eyes, bright and dark as polished obsidian, held no judgment. I did the same thing when I first returned. Took me 2 years before I touched a single stone. You lived in Babylon too? Ezra asked. Born there? Like both of you, I imagine? Tobiah began walking, gesturing for them to follow through the maze of partially reconstructed walls. My parents were taken in the first deportation, when Jehoiachin surrendered. I grew up believing Jerusalem was a fever dream. The old people shared a beautiful lie they told themselves to survive. Miriam found herself leaning forward slightly, hungry for someone who understood. When I finally came here, 15 years ago now, I expected to feel. Tobiah paused, searching for the word complete, as if I'd been a fragment all my life, and this city was the vessel I'd been broken from. I thought I'd simply, fit back into place. But you didn't, Miriam said quietly. I felt more fractured than ever. Tobiah stopped at a section of wall that was further along than the others, solid, well-fitted stones, rising nearly to shoulder height. I almost went back to Babylon. Almost convinced myself that home was wherever you hung your cloak, and trying to reclaim something from the past was foolishness. What changed? Ezra asked. Tobiah ran his hand along the wall with something approaching tenderness. I met a family, the Avrams, father, mother, 4 children, grandmother who could barely walk. They'd been living in a collapsed house near the old market district, not one of the returning exiles, but one of the poor families who'd never been taken. The Babylonians hadn't considered them valuable enough to deport. He chuckled, but there was old pain beneath it. They'd survived 70 years by becoming invisible, by trusting no one, by building walls around their hearts, even as the walls of the city crumbled around them. And when we exiles came flooding back, full of our stories and our grief and our claims to property and inheritance, they saw us as invaders. A different kind of conqueror, but conquerors nonetheless. "What did you do?" Miriam asked. "Nothing, at first. I was too concerned with my own brokenness to notice theirs." Tobiah began walking again, and they followed. But one night, a winter night, when the winds came howling through every gap in every wall, I heard a child crying. The youngest Avram girl, Rachel, was her name. Only 5 years old and weeping because the cold had gotten into their shelter and she couldn't feel her feet. Tobiah stopped at the base of a stairway that had been cleared among the rubble. I brought her to my fire. Then I brought her family. The grandmother didn't want to come. She spat at me and called me a Babylonian dog. But eventually, when her daughter was shivering too hard to light their own fire, she relented. "And that's when you started to feel at home," Ezra guessed. "No." Tobiah smiled that unsettling smile again. "That's when I started to understand what home actually is. We sat around that fire as strangers who shared bloodlines that went back 1,000 years to the same ancestor, yet who had become foreigners to each other through circumstances neither of us had chosen. And as we sat there, not speaking, just surviving together, I realized something." He turned to face them fully, and Miriam saw that his eyes were glistening. "Home isn't a place you return to. It's something you build, stone by stone, trust by trust, meal by meal. It's not waiting for you in the foundations of an old house. It's waiting to be created from the connections between one heart and another." The days that followed were some of the hardest of Miriam's life, and, paradoxically, some of the most meaningful. Tobiah assigned her to work alongside a woman named Hadassah, a round-faced widow in her 40s, who had returned from Babylon on the same caravan as Miriam, but to whom Miriam had never spoken. Hadassah talked constantly as they worked, filling the air with stories and observations and philosophical tangents that seemed to have no beginning or end. At first, Miriam found it exhausting. Then she found it oddly comforting. And eventually, she found herself talking back. "I had 3 children, Hadassah said one afternoon as they sorted stones by size, the sun beating down on their covered heads, 2 boys and a girl. The boys died in a plague when they were small. The girl, Malia, she married a merchant and moved to Susa. Said she couldn't bear to leave Babylon, that the journey would kill her even if the bandits didn't." Hadassah set down a large stone and wiped her brow. "She said I was chasing ghosts, coming here. Said I was abandoning her to chase the dream of dead ancestors. Was she right?" Miriam asked before she could stop herself. Hadassah considered the question with more seriousness than Miriam expected. "Maybe, in the beginning, I was so desperate to feel something other than grief that I convinced myself a change of landscape would do it, as if pain couldn't cross a desert." She picked up another stone, turned it in her hands, but somewhere along the way, the reason changed. I stopped coming here to escape my grief. I started coming here to build something through it. What do you mean? Hadassah looked at the section of wall they'd been working on, still rough, still incomplete, but undeniably there. Every stone I place for Leah, not because she'll ever see it. She won't. But because building something, being part of something larger than my own little heartbreak, makes the heartbreak matter. It transforms it from just suffering into a brick in a wall that might shelter someone else's daughter someday. That night, Miriam lay awake in the small shelter she shared with Ezra, staring at the ceiling of branches and cloth and thinking about what Hadassah had said, about Tobiah's words, about the wall that was slowly rising, stone by stone, from the very rubble that had seemed so hopeless a few months ago. She thought about her grandmother, Keturah, who had died, still longing for a home she never saw again. She thought about her mother, who had grown so brittle and distant in her final years that Miriam sometimes wondered if she'd died long before her body stopped breathing. She thought about herself, always floating, never anchoring, terrified to plant roots, because she'd watched what happened when people lost the ground they'd planted in. But that was the thing, wasn't it? The ground hadn't disappeared. It had been broken, scattered, transformed by violence and time into something unrecognizable. And now, here, in the dust and sweat and unexpected camaraderie of this reconstruction effort, she was watching something remarkable happen. People who had every reason to remain strangers returned exiles, and those who'd never left. Wealthy merchants and poor laborers, the devout and the doubting, were laying stones side by side. They were building something together, not because they'd resolved all their differences, but because they'd discovered that the building itself was the resolution. 3 months later, the Eastern Wall was complete. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Jerusalem had seen in generations. Not at all because of its grandeur, but because of its improbability. Families who had eyed each other with suspicion now shared bread. Children who had been taught to mistrust anyone outside their immediate circle played together in the shadows of walls they'd watched their parents build. The old grandmother of the Avram family, whom Tobiah had introduced to Miriam and Ezra as the woman who once spat on me and is now my fiercest defender, sat in a place of honor, wrapped in blankets and wearing an expression that fell somewhere between bewildered and genuinely happy. Miriam found herself sitting between Hadassah and a young man named Joram, who was one of the never-left families who had initially regarded the returning exiles with barely concealed hostility. Now, Joram was passing her a cup of wine and telling her about his plans for the next section of wall, where he hoped to include a gate dedicated to the memory of all those who had died during the exile, both those who had gone and those who had stayed. My grandfather used to tell me that the walls falling was punishment, Joram said quietly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. That we were abandoned by every god that ever watched over us. But now, he shook his head slowly. Now I think maybe the falling was just the falling. And the building is just the building. And what makes it sacred isn't whether some deity ordains it, but whether we manage to do it together, without killing each other. Miriam laughed, a real laugh, surprised at her own outburst of sudden joy. That's a fairly low bar. You've met people, right? Joram grinned. Low bars are appropriate. If this story resonates with you, or if you've ever felt like a stranger in a place where you were supposed to belong, like you're building something without being sure of the foundation, know that you are not alone. Share it forward. Later that evening, Nehemiah himself addressed the gathering. He was a smaller man than Miriam had expected. The stories had painted him as a giant, inexhaustible and fearless. But there was a quiet authority in his bearing that transcended physical stature. "I have letters," he said, holding up a bundle of scrolls. "From the apostles in the diaspora, from communities of our people scattered across Persia and Media and Egypt. They ask about our progress. They send what resources they can spare. And in every letter, the same question: do we still belong? After all this time, after all this distance, are we still part of the household?" He set down the letters. "I want to share with you words that I believe speak to this question. Words that I've carried with me through exile and return, through the burning of every house I ever knew and the building of every wall we've constructed together." Nehemiah's voice shifted, taking on the cadence of remembered scripture. "You are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens, members of God's household, built on the foundation of the prophets, with God Himself as the chief cornerstone. In Him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple. And in Him you too are being built together to become a dwelling place." Ephesians 2, verses 19 through 22. Miriam felt something shift in her chest. That hollow space that had lived there so long, she'd almost forgotten it wasn't natural. It didn't fill exactly, but it changed. As if someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed for years, and fresh air was slowly seeping in. "We are not building walls," Nehemiah continued. "Not really. We are building a household. We are taking people who were scattered by conquest, by exile, by the ordinary drift of generations, and we are fitting them together like stones. Not because they are perfect. Look at any wall, and you will see gaps, cracks, stones that fit imperfectly. But a wall with imperfect stones is still a wall. A household with imperfect members is still a household. And when we build together, we become something that none of us could be alone." He paused, surveying the crowd, the mix of faces, the varieties of clothing and custom, the old wounds that still showed in cautious glances and old resentments not quite forgotten. "Some of you grew up in Babylon. Some of you never left Jerusalem. Some of you lost everything in the destruction. Some of you lost everything in being protected from the destruction. And somehow, impossibly, we are sitting here together, sharing bread, building walls, becoming, stone by stone and day by day, a household in a small apartment 3,000 years removed. A woman named Sandra sits at her kitchen table, staring at a text message she cannot bring herself to answer. It's from her sister, the one who sided with their father during the divorce, the one who moved across the country and became a stranger wearing a familiar face. The message simply asks, "Can we try again?" Sandra's thumb hovers over the keyboard, paralyzed by 20 years of accumulated rubble, wondering if some walls are too broken to rebuild, even as something deep inside her whispers that any house can be restored if someone is willing to lay the first stone. On the morning of the Eastern Wall's dedication, Miriam rose before dawn and walked alone to the section she had worked on most diligently. The air was cool and smelled of rain that had fallen overnight, leaving the stones slick and somehow more alive. She found the spot she was looking for, a particular stone near the base, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She had found it in the rubble of her grandmother's house, buried beneath decades of debris. It was nothing special in size or shape, but when she'd cleaned it, she'd discovered marks on one side, a crude carving of a branch with leaves, her great-grandmother's house sign, according to the stories Keturah had told. She had worked that stone into the wall herself, positioning it where it would bear weight, would support the stones above it. It had felt right, using something from what was destroyed to build what was being restored. Not erasing the past, but incorporating it, making it a foundation rather than a grave. Now, standing before it in the pre-dawn quiet, she placed her palm flat against its surface. "I think I understand now," she said softly. "What you were trying to tell me, grandmother. All those stories about belonging to this place, you weren't saying we had to return to feel whole. You were saying that wholeness was possible, that broken things can be rebuilt, that being scattered doesn't have to be permanent." The stone was cool beneath her hand, silent in the way stones are, but somehow not indifferent. "I've been so angry at you, sometimes," Miriam continued, "for making me want something I wasn't sure existed, for planting this longing in me that felt like it could never be satisfied. But I don't think you were lying. I think you were just hoping out loud, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's what foundations are. The hopes of people who came before, strong enough to build on." Footsteps behind her, Ezra, because of course it was Ezra, arriving with the uncanny timing he'd developed for finding her during emotional moments. "Talking to walls now?" he asked gently. "Talking to grandmother through the wall." Ezra came to stand beside her, looking at the stone she'd placed. "The house sign. I thought I recognized it. She's part of this now? Part of what we're building?" Miriam finally let her hand drop. "And so are we." She turned to face her brother. "I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "To stop floating." Miriam felt the truth of the words as she spoke them. To actually be here. Not just physically, but here. To let this place become home, not because it matches some perfect image from the stories, but because I'm going to build it into a home, stone by stone, day by day, however long it takes. Ezra was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and squeezed her shoulder. A gesture so like their father before the bitterness took him that Miriam felt her eyes sting. "That's what they mean, you know," he said. "The old words. About being built together into a dwelling place. It's not about architecture. It's about people like us deciding that we're going to be foundations for each other, that we're going to bear each other's weight, that when someone's crumbling, we're going to shore them up, and when we're crumbling, we're going to let them shore us up too." "When did you get so wise?" "I've been working with Tobiah. He talks a lot." They stood together as the sun crested the hills, spilling golden light across the walls they had helped rebuild. The city was still broken in places, still scarred, still incomplete. Years of work remained before it would resemble anything like the stories Keturah had told. But it was rising, imperfect and patched and built from 100 different sources, but rising, and the people rising with it were being transformed in the building. Former strangers becoming family, former skeptics becoming believers, former hollow places filling slowly with purpose and connection and a hope that finally felt grounded in something real. Miriam looked at her brother, at the wall, at the city spreading out before her in all its ruined and rebuilding glory. "Let's go find Tobiah," she said. "I want to know what section we're working on next." Years later, when Miriam had silver in her hair and grandchildren of her own, she would tell them about the building of the walls, not as ancient history, but as living instruction. "We are all stones," she would say, gesturing with hands that still remembered the weight of limestone and the grit of mortar. "Some of us are large and imposing. Some of us are small and seem insignificant. Some of us are cracked, broken from walls that fell long ago. But every one of us has a place. Every one of us can bear weight. And when we fit ourselves together, when we stop trying to be complete on our own and instead become part of something larger, we become a household, a dwelling place, a home that nothing can destroy because it lives in the connections between us. Her grandchildren would squirm and fidget as children do, not understanding how these words about ancient walls could possibly matter in their immediate world of games and small concerns. But the words would stay with them, would sink into their foundations the way her grandmother's stories had sunk into hers, would wait there, dormant, until they faced their own ruins, their own moments of floating, of disconnection, of wondering if they belonged anywhere at all. And then, when they most needed it, they would remember. They would remember that being broken is not the end. They would remember that strangers can become family. They would remember that every household begins with a single stone, laid in hope, and rises through the patient work of hands that refuse to give up. And they would begin to build. Across this 5-part journey, we have seen the ancient wounds that still echo in our modern homes: absence, imbalance, fracture, and the longing to return to one another. Yet every story has shown us the same truth. When a single household begins to heal, its restoration radiates outward, touching the community, the city, and even the nation. No matter what your family looks like today, your first small act of rebuilding becomes a stone in a much greater wall. And as this season of rebuilding draws to a close, another begins. For every restored household rests on deeper foundations. The inner strengths, quiet choices, and guiding virtues that shape who we are and who we become. In our next journey together, we will explore these pillars of character and how they steady our homes, our hearts, and our world. Your healing matters. Your household matters. By tending to what's broken within your own walls, you become part of a restoration larger than yourself, a spiritual rebuilding that echoes through generations. If this story has moved you, if it has sparked something in your own journey toward restoration, we'd love to hear from you. Like this story, leave a comment, sharing your own experience with rebuilding, whether walls, relationships, or your sense of belonging. And subscribe to join a community of people who believe that broken things can be made whole again. The household is still being built. Your stone has a place in it. Beloved soul, let us take a quiet moment together. Holy One, you who rebuild what is broken and gather what has been scattered, we thank you for the reminder that every household, no matter its history, no matter its fractures, can rise again through your grace. Teach us to become living stones in the walls you are restoring. Strengthen the places within us that have grown weary. Heal the wounds we have carried alone. Guide our hearts back to one another with patience, compassion, and courage. May our homes become sanctuaries of peace. May our families become vessels of hope. And may the light you kindle within us radiate outward to heal our communities, our cities, and our nation. Walk with us as we rebuild, stone by stone, day by day, knowing that your presence is the foundation that never crumbles. Amen. And as always, peace, love, light, and unity.
Thank you for sharing this sacred story with me. If it touched your heart, you may also find peace and clarity in our Meditative Reflections playlist, a series of guided meditations inspired by these very Bible stories. Each one is crafted to help you slow down, breathe deeply, and connect more fully with God's presence in your life. Remember to subscribe, leave a comment if something resonated with you, and share this with someone who may need a little hope today. Until next time, transforming minds and empowering souls, and as always, peace, love, light, and unity.